Everybody. I would like to start by thanking you for your service. I think that getting mentors in all of our REU programs is an ongoing opportunity for us to engage with the most interesting, caring, and kind individuals in the scientific community. And I know that all of our programs are so dependent on our mentors. We're really excited to have you joining us today for this talk about inclusive mentoring and to be welcomed into our community. I know many of us as program leaders started out mentoring in our programs, or perhaps even started out as students being mentored by some of you. So today we're going to talk about inclusive mentoring. I'm just going to take a moment to share my screen here. And I'm going to recognize that in the room we have so much expertise. We're certainly not the keepers of all knowledge, and we value all the work that you do to support, especially the science of your students. We know that you know how to do that much better than us in most cases. So today's inclusive mentoring workshop will focus a little bit more on the relationship side of mentoring, though we will share a number of resources with you that may help you out in the future. This inclusive mentoring workshop, which I'm delighted to lead with my friend and colleague Dana Stamo, who is a graduate student at CU Boulder, incorporates the wisdom of so many people, including Val, who co-leads this network, the entire GeoREU network, and the SOARS community, where I was lucky to learn how to be a mentor. Dana, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes. Hi, everyone. My name is Dana. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am a third-year graduate student at CU Boulder. I study biological engineering, so I find new medicines and therapeutics for bacterial infections. And when I'm not doing research, I collaborate with a bunch of other graduate students who, like myself, also had a sort of non-traditional path to their graduate program. So be that first generation or low income, transfer students, international students, anyone who's underrepresented in their field. We acknowledge that there's all sorts of unique paths to making it to graduate school. And we're trying to provide the support and serve as the mentors we wish we had when we were navigating all of the secret handshakes and sort of hidden etiquette of how to access and make yourself a good candidate for a graduate program. So now our program has grown significantly, and we created our very own undergraduate research training program, which is in its first full year now. We got some great Packard funding to make it happen, and we're so stoked about keeping it growing throughout the university.
Thanks, Dana. I'm Beck Batchelor. My pronouns are she, hers, and I work in series education at the University of Colorado Boulder, including with a community college program called REX. And I'm extremely proud to be part of this GeoREU network. And the GeoREU network is a network of people who run all sorts of different internships, particularly those funded under the NSF Geo programs. And we have a huge number of resources on our website, which I've linked here, and Val will pop into the chat. Thank you for joining us today. The GeoREU network is all about learning and growing together, and we're committed to having a shared and productive space for everybody involved. So I'd like to start by asking you a question. How do your experiences with mentorship lead to you being here today? You're welcome to just open your microphone up and speak up, or to pop those in the chat. Perhaps you had no mentorship. Perhaps you wanted mentorship, or you had a really positive or a really negative opportunity to be mentored.
This can also include you as the mentor or as the mentee.
I'll jump in.
Yeah, please.
So, as you shared, I manage internship program, and through my career in other positions, I've always had I've managed internships actually for a long time, several different types of internships. And but when I started my current position, I really wanted to see what's the best kind of ROI that I could do for my programs. And through research and interacting with other people or asking around, I realized that mentorship is a very, in those of us who are working in like pathways and supporting diversity in STEM, mentorship is really a really kind of valuable, sort of relatively achievable thing that we can change or influence as program managers, right? As REU program managers. And so what, after a few discussions and so on, actually we created a program in our center to train mentors and mentees. And so just, my anecdote is more about, or my story is about how I've been an intern, I've managed internships, and throughout, I didn't realize, or until I had this aha moment about the power of good, solid mentorships, and how both mentors and mentees, we don't know how to be either unless we go through training, right? And so if you're a grad student and then you graduate, now you have students and now you're a mentor, but somewhere along the way you didn't get the resources, you don't know how to be a mentor. And so sometimes we expect students to tell us what they need, but they don't know how to be a mentee either. So, I really like what, Dana, you were sharing about putting together resources, because again, we assume that as mentors, sometimes we assume that mentees will tell us their needs. And as mentees, we assume that our mentors will know what we need. And, it's kind of like a dynamic, two sides of the same coin, as I like to think of it. And so it's just valuable for all of us to get some sort of resources, training, whatever we can, and make a kind of impact in our relationships.
Thanks, Gabby. You lead us so clearly into the sort of inclusive mentoring space that we're about to share with you. I am, I think just to summarize what I'm seeing here in the chat is so many of us have had really positive mentoring experiences that led us to become mentors ourselves. So this flow-on impact of our mentoring experience is huge. And there's also many people who perhaps had less than positive mentoring experiences that also shape where they want to be. I'm really inspired by all of you who already have a lot of mentoring experience, but continue to learn and grow together and share your experiences and learn the new needs of our current generation of students.
All right, so I love this conversation so much, and I love everything that you brought up, because I think mentorship programs are something that appears kind of everywhere, and oftentimes mentorship programs are used as this sort of superficial band-aid for sort of norms that can cause harm that are just built into the daily life of our professional contexts. So one important key piece that I read in a lot of my research on mentorship is that a good mentorship program is awesome. It can bring a lot of good. It can be really helpful. But a bad mentorship program or a bad mentorship experience can actually cause more harm than a good program would bring benefit, just because of the way that factors into students' perceived identities. And so the fact that you're all here is really awesome. I'm a firm believer that mentorship is not something that can be taught, but it can be learned. And so what we're trying to do with the entirety of this workshop is to create a space and a dialogue for you all to learn on your own. I can't tell you how to respond to every unique situation that you're going to face as a mentor, but I can help you train sort of this critical nuance muscle and help you navigate situations as they come up. So the foundation for everything we're going to talk about today is sort of a shift from this traditional hierarchy-based mentorship that you're probably all familiar with. So this was born out of a situation in which one person who was more experienced in executing a task had to teach someone who was less experienced in executing that task how to do the task better. And this works really well when you have like a distinct, tangible task to execute. But as we shift towards the more nebulous, high-level critical thinking space that is research, all of a sudden that kind of breaks down because it isn't quite as black and white as executing a task or learning the steps or even getting trained and getting the experience to do a task well. At this point, we have to factor in things like code switching, professionalism, academic norms. Okay, we're good. And so one sort of byproduct of using this traditional hierarchical mentorship style, what can happen is you'll see mentors creating almost mini me's out of their mentees, where they just tell their mentee what to do without giving the mentee an opportunity to learn how or why. And now I want to be really clear that I'm not trying to downplay the importance of conveying transfer of scientific techniques and how to do the research. But we need to factor in this more inclusive mentoring approach so that we can teach students how to come into their own as scientists and researchers as well. So we actually draw a lot of inspiration from seeing how peer mentorship programs play out. So peer mentorship programs are really cool because they eliminate the hierarchy, and now all of a sudden people have equal footing in this space. And so there isn't sort of this top-down approach of just telling someone what to know. Instead, we're teaching them how to think and how to reach solutions on their own and empowering that learning in their own right. Can you hop back to that previous slide, Beck, so we can watch that video? This is a short skit of what a traditional hierarchical mentorship relationship could look like.
Hey, Professor, I'm here for our meeting to continue working on that research paper. Great. Where did we leave off? I know we just met last week and had a very detailed conversation about this project, but as your advisor, I forgot about 95% of that discussion. And I'm slowly learning to not internalize that as a form of personal rejection. Looking at the analyses now, I see we ran analysis A, but I think we should run analysis B instead. Okay, but I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes trying to remind you how we had this conversation last week and you decided that analysis A was the better choice. And then I'm going to disregard all of that and say we run analysis B over the weekend anyway. You say we, but you really mean me. You got me there, but don't worry, I will vastly underestimate how long it will take for you to put in this extra work and reassure you that it'll just take a few minutes. And after I put all that extra effort in, you're gonna remember why option A was better. That's probably accurate. It probably is. Well, good luck on that analysis that I'm gonna change my mind on again. I'll see you next week. See you next week. I'm gonna forget this conversation as soon as you walk out the door.
So what I really want to highlight with that video, as you can tell, it is very much a skit. It is very much exaggerated, but it does bring to the surface some pretty insidious and covert ways that contribute to students not feeling heard and not feeling seen. And so if we were to sort of shift this perspective and view it as someone who were on equal footing, having a discussion with a colleague, it would be more about, a situation where you trust the student when they remind you that we decided not to run analysis B, or you trust the student if they advocate for one analysis over the other, because this is empowering the student to make these decisions on their own. And if they don't go through the process of learning how to think through these kinds of questions, they're going to find themselves in a position where they're mentoring someone, just telling them what to do, not really knowing why, right? Can you advance to the next slide one more time so I can wrap everything up? Okay, so the key aspect of the inclusive mentorship piece is that it's creating a space for growth as an individual and growth as a person. And that means that the idea generation and the conversation is all collaborative. It isn't just telling someone what to execute. And this creates space for students to find their own unique identity and how they take up space in academic and research context. All right, I said my piece. It's back to you, Beck.
So how can we do that in the real world? I think first and foremost, be human. So many of us were led to this idea that to be a successful scientist, you had to leave yourself at the door, that you only came in and you worked entirely on science research, and at the end of the day, who knows what happened. So being willing to share with your mentees the things that are important to you is a really great way of starting to break down those barriers for inclusion. That might mean sharing your family, sharing your hobbies, talking about what you might have wished someone had told you way back when you were starting out. Maybe sharing some of your thoughts and the things that made you scared or nervous or made it challenging for you to progress. So for me, it's really important to share the fact that I am successfully having a higher education career with a family, that I love my pets, that I do things with my kids in the weekend. Because I know for many of us, especially as young women, we're told that you can choose between having a science career or having a family. So modeling that you can be both is a part of my own personal journey. And each of us comes at our humanity from different spaces and different experiences. You can also share your enthusiasm. And sadly, for many students, the first thing that they see about a science project is a deep scientific paper, which maybe they don't know how to read, and comes across as being somewhat dry and technical, which of course it is in science often. But there's so much more excitement about this work. Why are you doing what you're doing? What do you love doing about your research? Can you share some articles or some photos of some experiences that you've had that helps convey your excitement about your research? Also really encourage you to think about the big picture. When you're first coming out in science, you don't have that background knowledge to be able to ground that tiny little bit of research that you're doing in the bigger picture. But as an experienced scientist, you understand why you're doing it. So share the why behind what you're doing as part of getting your students excited about it. And I think also trying to share the idea that science is not always a straight line and that you don't know all the answers is really important, especially for students whose only previous experience with doing research has been in a lab, which does have a fixed outcome and where students will know what to go on. So some of those things about the enthusiasm and the questions about science need to come out in your mentorship.
All right, I want to talk about how important it is to be stupid in research. By definition, if you are doing research on a thing, you must admit that you do not know everything about the thing. And that is absolutely imperative. That's what enables you to ask questions and be curious about the space. But there's this sort of irony in having to acknowledge that you don't know everything sort of while you're in the lab or while you're in your office or, you know, behind closed doors, so to speak. And academia has this tendency, it has this culture where the moment that you step out of your lab, you have to perform that you know everything. And I don't know if you've ever been to a seminar in which there's always that one audience member who has to ask a question that's only, you know, very tangentially related to what was just presented, but it's almost this sort of checkmate moment of like, yeah, can't answer my question. Yeah, I'm smarter. I know more than you in this room. And this sort of performance of declaring social dominance in the academic space by pretending like we understand more than we do. And this contributes to a culture where it's really difficult to admit that you don't know something. Now, not only does, you know, is this harmful in the academic space and you find it contributing to imposter syndrome, which I'll talk about as well, but on the other hand, this shows up in mentorship as well, where maybe a student is asking for your advice on an experience that you haven't had, but academic culture demands that you have an answer for it anyway. And this creates a context where microaggressions can occur. Can you advance the slide back? All right, so I love talking about imposter syndrome because I don't actually believe in imposter syndrome. And the reason for that is imposter syndrome places the burden of experiencing the symptoms of imposter syndrome, right? This sense of like chronic perfectionism, workaholism, constant anxiety about being quote unquote found out. And that puts the burden of that experience on the person who's dealing with it. And I don't think it's any one individual's fault that they feel like an imposter. I think it all comes from performed know-it-allism and norms in the academic space that kind of demand that people perform their role and their knowledge, and their power dynamic is much greater than it is in actuality. We're not creating space for people to share moments where they don't know about things. So there's a statistic that women and people of color feel imposter syndrome more often than their white peers. But I think that's a little bit of a cop-out answer, because if you've been systemically excluded from a space for decades, for the entire history of the existence of that space, no wonder you feel like you don't belong. It was never designed for you. And the people who are celebrated and promoted in this space are going to reinforce the same norms that they succeeded in. They don't want to break the system that they won. And so I wanted to include this Twitter conversation that I found where a white professor at a university says, I studied at Cambridge, I made full professor by 40, I wrote 2 books. Why do I feel like a failure? And then a woman of color responds and says, maybe this will sound mean, but this is why I don't personally jive with the imposter syndrome term, because my feelings as a Black woman who academia systematically excludes are lumped in with the insecurities of successful white men. This has a big asterisk in that I don't think Twitter is the most constructive space for dialogue and personal growth, but I think that there's an important thing to recognize here. Imposter syndrome doesn't look the same for different kinds of people. And the unique challenges that you face are going to lead to a different experience. And that means you need different kinds of supports. The most important thing to recognize about this Twitter conversation is that neither experience is more valid than the other, and neither experience is fair. So we can use mentorship to create a context in which we're vulnerable, admitting when we don't know. And then the other side of this is that students are more comfortable learning in that space and figuring out what their own identity looks like. So that's a really important to sort of create space for not being perfect all the time in academia. I think that's your slide, Beck.
Yes, it is. Yeah, and when it comes to our science experience, both science and being an inclusive mentor are hard. We're learning together and we're sometimes gonna do it wrong. And I think that acknowledging that both as a mentor and as a scientist, when we're working with our students, is really valuable. We are all going to make mistakes. Sometimes our science is going to take us down dead ends. Sometimes we're really going to put our foot in it when we're working with our students. And so acknowledging that with your mentees and saying, I'm working really hard to be an inclusive mentor. I've done my homework to try and understand what your experiences might look like, but I'm not always going to get it right. Please share your feedback. Help me to learn and grow together with you. I can help with the science. You can help me with being a more inclusive mentor. But with that, I also encourage you to recognize that sometimes when we do get that feedback, it comes with defensiveness. And that's true whether we're responding.
Uh-oh.
We can't hear you, Beck.
So the real drama here is that I'm not screen sharing. So I could keep talking, but I wouldn't have my props.
Oh, I'll put a message in the text.
Yeah, given that she's frozen.
Oh, she is, okay.
Yeah, I worry that.
Well, maybe we could ask people for their thoughts and ideas.
Actually, yes. So our next slide was actually going to be, yep, she just dropped out. So our next slide was actually inviting you all to talk about ways that you can share your vulnerability. Beck, you're back.
I even came into the office and plugged into a landline on the campus. Who knows? I will share
Your
my
first
screen
mistake
again,
was trusting
please
campus
do.
Wi-Fi.
So how can you share your vulnerabilities with your students?
Could we stop sharing just so we can see each other's faces more, if this is a discussion point?
While we chat, yeah.
Thanks. So the question was, how can we show vulnerability?
Yeah, go ahead, Meg.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment that I really like the idea of calling out the imposter syndrome versus having felt isolated and like you don't belong, because you are actually isolated and you don't belong. So I guess I haven't been keeping up on the literature, because this is the first time that I actually heard that called out, and it is really resonating with me. And I think that's one really good way to start talking about vulnerability, and especially people who are at my career stage. I'm at the more advanced stages of my career. An awful lot of us have sort of come to that now, where we look back and go, oh, what if? So I think this is a really good place to start, to have a conversation where you talk about the difference and just lay it right out there. Do you know there's a difference between the imposter syndrome, which is very real, and feeling like you don't belong because you don't see people like you, and because the system isn't set up to deal with you? So I just wanted to share that.
Thank you, Meg, for sharing. Feynman?
Hi, that's Maureen. I don't know. I think I accidentally logged in through a different account and put my last name twice.
Maureen.
That's a heck of a promotion.
So I guess just as an example of a way that I am vulnerable with my mentees, whether that be like graduate students or undergrad advisees or REU participants, is in my personal experience, I started in a tenure track position that I was not successful in. I failed out of the tenure track and went on to have like a very happy and successful and rewarding career in the sciences. So, I guess that I just say that by way of like, putting that out there and saying like, hey guys, guess what the first thing I did is I failed. But that's not that like life is full of little failures, and that doesn't mean the end of a career or that you can't go on to make a meaningful contribution.
Thanks. I see Eleanor put in that she's working on a CV of failures to document them all as well as sharing them. What a wonderful idea.
Awesome.
That's a good idea.
Gabby, did you have something to add?
Well, yeah, sure. I don't know if this is so much a vulnerability, but what I like to do with students is share about being an immigrant and about my struggles with language and my accent and just all of the insecurities that come with being it's like a woman in STEM, but who also is an immigrant. And so especially when I'm doing outreach with students who are from other countries or who are also underrepresented. So I like to just straight out talk about all of my growth in that area and how I've had to work through all of those insecurities.
Thank you. And I think that that's such a great point, that each of us brings elements of our own identity to our research, whatever our identity and to bring all of the experiences that you had, not as a way of telling them that this is the way you necessarily need to do things, but to connect on a personal level. I love this comment about also talking about mental health and struggles that you might have, helping normalize that. Certainly an absolute pandemic of mental health crises for our students at this day and age.
Can I add something real quick, Beck?
You sure can.
So a lot of the examples that people brought up were like high value vulnerabilities. So things like not getting into a program or being an immigrant or, big career shifting experiences like that. And I wanted to acknowledge that all of those are so, so important, but I also want to highlight the more mundane vulnerability. So things as simple as like letting your Spotify playlists be visible when you share screen, like not rushing to hide everything. Even something like I have stickers of my favorite TV shows all over my water bottle, and this has initiated many a conversation with my students that's been really awesome, and we got to connect about something that wasn't purely academic. And then even something like, I'm not sure if you all can see in my teeny tiny video, but I have a facial piercing. I have my septum pierced, and I have had students come up to me and explicitly thank me for wearing it so shamelessly in an academic professional space, because they got to see that they have permission to dress the way that they want to and still be a scientist. So remember, it doesn't have to be these big career shifting or mental health related vulnerabilities. It can be something as simple as the way that you dress, your manner of speaking, your background on your computer, your history searches or anything. Or actually, one of my favorite ones that I do really want to mention here is that I'm very open with my students. I always forget unit conversions, and I will pull out my computer right in front of them and say 5 microliters to milliliters, please. And I want them to see that I don't have that information, tattooed on the back of my eyelids. That's something I look up all the time, and that's perfectly normal in research.
So what we're going to do now is a small activity focusing on active listening. And I know that as scientists, we go through so much training on how to write, how to speak, how to do research, how to quantify errors. But one of the things that's often missing from our education is really actively thinking about how we build our active listening skills. So here's 6 steps for active listening. First and foremost, pay attention. Really focus on the person that you're listening to. Withhold judgment. What do I mean by that? Don't try and think of the response to what the person is saying in the moment. Really listen to what they're saying without trying to find a solution. And reflect on it. What's the meaning of the question, of what's being discussed? Are they looking for a solution? Are they looking for an understanding? And then reflect back your understanding. So when you said that, I heard this, or I understand that you're feeling this way. Am I right in understanding that this is what's happening? And that's about clarifying questions. What are the questions that you might ask that help you to understand the perspective of what that person is saying to them? Finally, you can summarize the conversation, and it's only at that point that you might want to move into problem-solving mode, or just listen. And I think that many of the times when we're thinking about active listening, we need to check our own scientifically trained impulse to solve problems, and simply listen and ask the question, do you just need to be heard, or do you actually want help to solve the situation? So we're going to take a moment to practice our active listening. We're going to break you into groups of 2, and you're going to just nominate one speaker and one listener. And that person who's speaking should spend 1 to 2 minutes talking about your dream vacation. I'm going to give you something really easy here. And the listener should practice active listening. You're allowed to use body language, but in that first 1 to 2 minutes, please resist the urge to respond or do anything. Just listen. And then in the second 1 to 2 minutes, I encourage you to ask some curious questions. Tell me more about, or when you said that, or how did you feel when that happened? To practice this active listening muscle. Dana, are you able to break everybody out here?
Yeah, I just need 1 second to find out.
What about those of you who were doing the listening? Did you notice anything about how it felt to really concentrate and pay attention to somebody? Seeing some thumbs up.
I'll hop in and just say that I was pleasantly surprised at how fun it was, and I hadn't thought about some of the things that she was saying. So stopping myself from kind of going into my own thoughts was kind of fun.
Yeah, thanks for sharing. I think that it's a gift to actively listen to somebody, to take the time to put aside everything else, even the thoughts in your own head, and really concentrate on them. And then that feeds into our inclusive mentoring and how that might look when you meet with your mentees, to really stop and be present with them. And I know so many of us are doing so many things all at the same time, but part of being an inclusive mentor is taking that moment to really stop and listen to your mentees.
I think my favorite thing about this exercise is that you all spoke about something relatively mundane, right? A dream vacation, and you got to be vulnerable, right? Whether you were the listener or the speaker, and it didn't have to be a vulnerable topic, but you still felt seen and you still felt heard. So when we say be vulnerable, we don't mean like, let me tell you about my messy breakup last week. It can be something just like, I really want to see the redwoods. And that is vulnerability. That is significant. That brings people closer.
One of my favorite quotes. I've learned that people will forget what you said, and people will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. And I think that's really the heart and soul of inclusive mentoring, is creating a space where people feel heard and feel welcomed and feel included. And that's what you as mentors are trying to bring to the science experience of your students.
Oh, I have to verbalize one thing. Beck said the most incredible thing ever as we were preparing this workshop, having to do with that previous quote. She said that inclusive mentoring is meant to bring how you make people feel and what you do and say into closer synchronicity. And I love that so much. I had to amplify it real quick.
Thanks, Dana. But on the subject that Val raised, that many of us don't feel necessarily sure what that vulnerability should look like, or where our own personal boundaries are, I want to give you some tools to help provide scaffolding. So when you're doing your science research, think about how you might structure it so that your boundaries are clear, what your work plan looks like. Create a work plan together. As a mentor, your responsibility is not necessarily to tell your student what they're going to do every moment of the day, but to help them define their own pathway, help them to break up this big project into smaller ones. But it's also really helpful for you to think out loud and explore the process that you as a scientist go through with your student. Be flexible. This is a given in science because sometimes you think that project was going to be really straightforward and easy, and then it turns out that that data set didn't really have the data that you wanted, or your computer wasn't able to connect with the computer that you thought it might be, and you need to change the hypothesis of your project. That's science, but it's also true in mentoring, that's humans and that's relationships. And especially in this day and age, I think we have a new respect for the fact that life happens and that changes the way that we may be able to respond to a situation. When you're scaffolding your research projects, think about how you might plan small early successes. This is a really important part of building identity. So if in the first week, you can help your student to create a plot so that they have something in hand rather than just spend the first week reading research papers. That will help them to gain a sense of identity. Provide examples. I have certainly had students who thought that they had to learn how to understand an entire programming language from scratch to be able to write a program to make a plot, even though their mentors have provided an example of the code that they just had to adapt. So providing that example, but then being explicit about what's okay to adapt or change versus what needs to be developed from the ground up is really helpful for them to learn how the science process builds on the work of others and recognizes and rewards that. Think out loud. The process of thinking like a scientist is still a new skill for our early career scientists. So the more that you can make explicit the unwritten rules, whether that's to do with culture, whether that's to do with how you might interact within your group, or whether that's to do with the science project that you're working on, all of those things will help your student to understand what the environment that they're working in is. And then be really explicit about expectations. Break things down and tell them what you expect and what you need. And that includes around setting boundaries and being what you'd like them to share, what you might not like them to share, and what you need them to do and by when. And there's some tools that can help you do that. And we're going to share a number of these as documents that you can go back to afterwards. Things like using work plans and setting up communications, discussions and plans at the beginning.
So people's identities, particularly in STEM, are a combination of how they perceive themselves and how they think other people perceive them. So your role as a mentor is to make sure that you are demonstrating to your student that you perceive them as a scientist. And there's a number of really awesome, tangible ways you can do this. I wanted to draw your attention to this little comic at the bottom of this slide because I think it's a great illustration of what I'm talking about. Mentorship is saying, hey, I think you'd be really good for speaking at a conference. You should go apply for some. Versus sponsorship, which is, hey, my buddy is looking for an undergraduate researcher to present their work and I gave them your name. Are you able to do it? So rather than saying, hey, here's more work that you need to do in order to advance your own career on your own, what you can do as a sponsor, rather than just sort of giving people the guidelines, is to just do that work for them, right? Leverage your network, leverage your connections so that you can sort of amplify and accelerate this pipeline so students have fewer and fewer barriers to what they want to achieve. This can also be something as simple as just talking about graduate school with your student and setting up like what that timeline might look like and thinking about places where you can plug in and empower a student to take those steps on their own. Sometimes all it takes is someone looking at a student and saying, I think you'd be an amazing researcher. Let's talk about what you would need if you want graduate school to be an option for you in the future. And another thing I want to mention here is actually to give a bit of an anecdote about sort of a seemingly mild way that I empowered my student, but it actually went a really long way in giving her the confidence to be a researcher. I had started bringing her to my lab meetings and she was always very quiet. And so I asked her, like, is there something that, what kind of goals are you looking for over the next semester or the next year? And she said, well, I really want to learn how to think critically, but quickly. in scientific conversations. So I said, okay, well, let's ask more questions during the lab group meetings. And she was like, oh, no, like, what if my question is dumb? What if someone already asked it? What if it's really obvious? And I said, okay, well, instead of verbalizing your question, I want you to write down 3 to 5 questions throughout each group presentation. And this does 2 things. On the one hand, she gets to see physical written evidence if someone asks a question that she already had written down. That's really validating for a student that they're thinking critically on par with another grad student or professor. And then on the other hand, we were able to look at those questions together afterwards, and I can highlight to her that these are all really good questions. And this helped her build the confidence to verbalize these questions rather than me just telling her to ask the question or telling her to just, face her fear. We got to work on it behind the scenes and develop that confidence without having to put her in a situation she was uncomfortable in, which I think is a great segue for you, Beck.
I'm watching our time here, Dana.
Noted.
I do want to recognize that there are a lot of sources of stress in an REU. We have taken these students, in most cases, out of their comfort zone. Scientifically, we've moved them from where they're comfortable into this point of maximum learning, where they're learning rapidly a new science, a new field. On top of that, we're moving them into a professional environment that may be different from that they've had before, and they want to impress, they want to convey their professionalism. And we've moved them into a whole new environment where they may no longer have their support structures. So they might be living in a different city, they may be struggling to find the food that they like to eat or the person to cut their hair that they're used to. And so all of these things tie in to the sources of stress about wanting to make a good impression, doing really good science, and still wanting to be true to who you are. So recognize that there's a lot of sources of stress that your students might be undergoing, and then very few of them are actually to do with you or your science, but that as an inclusive mentor, you can acknowledge that they exist and they're part of going through this process of a research experience. That said, you don't have to be Yoda or Lucy. You don't have to provide the emotional support for your students. And this is, again, culturally relevant. Encouraging your students to get the support they need from the people that they need it, to reach out to their friends or their community, to help them connect with a church, to broaden their circle of mentors, and to provide resources for professional counseling are all part of building up that network of support. You don't have to be everything to everybody, but you can be a really successful mentor by helping your student to connect to the people that can help them in all these different spheres. And for many of us white mentors who may be mentoring students of color, helping connect them to affinity groups like SACNAS or Black engineers or whatever is happening on your department may be the way that you can help support that aspect of their identity while you're working to develop their science identity. And I really encourage you to check out the Earth Science Women's Network mentoring map as an option for this and talking about it and recognizing that each individual needs a really big network of mentors and that different people are going to fulfill some of these roles at different times in your life, and encouraging them to try and identify people for each of these supportive mentoring roles, from substantive feedback and professional development to emotional support and safe space, and recognizing that the person that you vent the problems that you have with your roommate or your mentor may not best be the same person that's advocating for you behind closed doors. So helping your students work out who they can go to for success and where the boundaries that they should put in is also a really strong part of inclusive mentoring. So I encourage you to think about what supports you might need to be the mentor that you can be. And Dana, I'm skipping over you here, but
That's okay.
we want to give time to ask some questions.
Totally.
We are going to share some resources with you. There's some sample communication and work plans. There's curious questions that you can ask to help get to know your students in a vulnerable way. We've got some effective communication worksheets and examples of how you can set up your mentoring and boundaries handouts. We've collected natural crisis hotlines in case you need to have those on hand, and some other useful resources, as well as having a PDF of this presentation in this drive, which I will put in the chat right now. Oh, I think Dana already did. Sometimes I think that we forget too, that mentoring is a really important two-way relationship, and that mentors express so many reasons why they mentor. They get new directions for their work, they develop personal relationships, they become excited again about their science from seeing it through a new lens, get new ideas, they build satisfaction and build friendships and create relationships. And so don't forget that mentoring is a two-way relationship, and the most important thing that you can get out of your mentoring relationship is to have some fun. So thank you again for your service to our community, for stepping up as mentors and being willing to continue this lifelong journey about how we can do better in making science a more inclusive and welcoming space. I know both Dana and I are more than happy for you to email us if you have questions. And I'm going to just turn off my screen share so that we can share tips and questions across the whole group. Feel free to speak up. I'm seeing that there's some really fantastic suggestions and feedbacks in the chat, so we'll make sure that those are also collected and popped into that drive.
You bet.
Does anybody want to ask questions? Or share their own tips about inclusive mentoring? Dana and I'll stay online for a little bit longer if you want to stay on, but we respect your time and thank you for joining us and sharing all your thoughts across this discussion.
Thank you so much.
See, Eleanor,
There's a hand up. Yeah.
Go ahead,
Yeah.
Eleanor.
I just wanted to say that one of the most interesting things I heard through URGE was the concept of being a nightlight. And it just resonated with me so much. I don't know how many of you were in URGE, but the concept of a nightlight is somebody that they're not really a full-time mentor, but they're there at the right time to illuminate a path that is otherwise obscure to somebody who's never navigated that space before. And I think that kind of mentoring can be so impactful if even when you're not the full-time person who's guiding the whole career, just being that right person at the right place at the right time to illuminate a path can make a huge difference. So it just resonated with me. I wanted to share that with you all.
I love
that, Eleanor. I love the idea of being a nightlight. Georgianne.
Yeah, I just love your figure with the sort of the comfort space and then the learning space and then the panic space. That is so true. I just wanted to comment that I've noticed that with students throughout an REU program, that the size of those spaces moves back and forth a lot. So the understanding of sort of that temporal dynamic to the REU program, how they get in and out of their comfort zone all the time, I think has been something that I have really tried to work to navigate, but is one of the hardest parts because you want to keep them in that learning space and out of the panic space, but it's really impossible to do that at every moment.
I love sharing it with the students and saying, we're going to push you to this point of maximum learning, and it's okay to move into the panic space occasionally at that point, but you don't want to stay there. And if you feel like you're stuck in this panic space, this is a really good time to reach out to your REU program lead or to your mentor and redefine what you're doing so that it feels like you're learning, but you're not at the point where you're no longer functioning. Thank you all so much for being here. Still open for questions if anyone has anything they want to share.